Hello, hello. Time to get started once again, I think. So welcome, everyone, to the sort of penultimate session of the day, looking at organizational and people impact. I will say, I am a native English speaker, and I do talk quite fast anyway. So if I'm going too fast, chuck up your hand. I did this talk, actually, I did a similar talk for Halfa earlier on in the year, I think it was last year, and actually did my first sort of paragraph of text, and everyone put up their hand. So I'm going to try to, not go too fast. But I've had some interesting chats with people at the conference today already about sort of the organizational and people kind of side of microservices. And the high-level TLDR, the high-level takeaways of this talk, is pretty much most of the problems that I'm seeing as a consultant are kind of related when implementing microservices with people and the organization. Yeah. Now, arguably, you can replace the word microservices there with technology in general. I think, yeah, a few of us would say that's fair. But the good news is we've already got some solutions to deal with these. Business people have been going through some of these challenges that we're now seeing by breaking up our systems, breaking up our teams. And I think we can learn from some of the things we do. Or they do, I should say. Very quickly, this is me. Feel free to tweet at me. Love getting involved on Twitter, at Daniel Bryant UK. I work as a consultant here in Germany and in the UK as well. I've done everything from front end, back end, bit of DBA as well. I try and code every day as much as I do a lot of leadership, a lot of architecture stuff these days. Firm believer in continuous delivery, and I'll talk more about that later. But just got a mini book that's come out on O'Reilly. It's a free mini book sponsored by Nginx. Kudos to Nginx. So if you want to know more about Docker, Java, continuous delivery, hopefully that will be a good start for you to have a look at. So I want to caveat what I'm going to say with a bit of a preamble in that microservices and the adoption of where they are has dramatically changed over the last few years. Now, this conference, I think, has been running for 3 years, for example. And I'm sure the people coming along have very much changed. The organizations you represent are different than when the conference started, for example. I think it's fair to say now that microservices are here in terms of diffusion of innovation. Now, if you haven't heard of the concept before, the argument is all technology goes through this cycle of diffusion. It starts by the innovators, the kind of early adopters, later arrivals to the technology. If that makes sense, yeah. If you notice there is a crossing the chasm moment. A lot of technologies get innovated, early adopters pick them up, but they don't quite make it across the chasm, if you like. For various reasons, maybe technical, social, or monetary, they don't make it into the mainstream. But I think microservices very much have, but this means there's a lot more challenges now with us adopting microservices. People like Netflix, like Amazon, like Spotify, microservices emerged from their organizational practices, their people, and their technology. And now many of us are trying to copy microservices without doing those things first. We're kind of coming at it from the other way, if that makes sense, yeah. And that's inevitable with any kind of technology. My kind of pitch really is we need 3 things. We need to think about strategy and tactics at all different levels. We need to optimize for feedback, hopefully sort of a no-brainer, and we need to define responsibilities as well. That's my kind of 3 key pitches for today. So first off, strategy. Super important, right from the kind of dev level, definitely an architectural level, and very much kind of like a business level, obviously. Many companies don't do strategy too well. I think we can all agree on that one, yeah? I'm sure a few of you might recognize this graphic on there. You've got to ask yourself, first off, are microservices a good fit in terms of strategy, yeah? Broadly speaking, we'll dive more into these things and unpack them over the next 40 minutes. But we're getting a lot of this kind of, our Mode 2 apps are microservices. Now, Mode 2 is a Gartner thing. It's very much like their systems of engagement, your forward-facing applications. They're saying they should be nimble, they should be agile. All makes sense, but middle management are kind of latching on to microservices as a buzzword to deliver that kind of functionality. And Oliver already mentioned it earlier on. If you kind of just rebrand things, all you're really doing is putting lipstick on the pig, yeah? And as we know, it looks great at sort of first glance, but by the second day, it's all going to be going wrong. Yes, it's really not good. Not understanding architectural principles is a key thing we're seeing as well. I think Stefan talks a lot about sort of self-contained systems. I know Eberhard does as well. These things, in my mind, are critical for microservices, building around business functionality, and also building what we're kind of calling as cloud-native apps, apps that are aware of the fabrics they're being deployed onto now. You've probably heard of 12 factors, things like that, 15 factors. I think this makes a lot of sense as well in terms of strategy. We're also seeing like no well-defined kind of DevOps or site reliability engineering. And it's on an extreme from, DevOps is kind of a developer with root access to production, which is a bit sketchy, through to kind of massive change control. There's a happy medium there somewhere, yeah. But this is definitely sort of the three challenges we see broadly in our consulting work. Now, we've already had this mentioned today once already. Microservices are kind of not a silver bullet. We know silver bullets are a bad thing in general, or a thing that doesn't exist. If you haven't got a well-defined business strategy or a tech strategy, microservices are probably not the solution. Yeah? The thing you need to really do is determine your business goals, create a hypothesis, choose tech and implement if necessary, and then validate. If we can make money as a business by not using tech, arguably that's even better than using expensive tech, for example. So asking ourselves what are our goals in a business is pretty much we're going to add some form of value to end users, to customers. When you dive into that a little bit more, it's all about business agility now. Adrian Cockcroft, talking tomorrow, talks a lot about speed kills. And you look at successful organizations like Netflix, like Amazon, like Spotify, they're very speedy in terms of getting stuff to market. When you really break it down, it's about safer, more rapid changes to software systems. If you haven't got to build software, great, but if you have, it's got to be safe, it's got to be rapid. But I see people jumping to microservices when in reality, considering things like continuous integration, continuous deployment, these kind of things, continuous delivery, DevOps, and even understanding your value stream as a business, these are really the first things we should be doing. If we cannot reliably deploy changes quickly into production, if we cannot have shared responsibility in terms of who's fixing what, and if the value stream, all that effectively is the kind of the stream from idea creation to adding value in production. The stream of kind of activities that go on. And if we don't know our value stream and we don't know where the blockages are, it might not actually be tech, or it might be tech, it might be QA as opposed to dev, these kind of things. If we don't know our value stream, we're often with microservices optimizing for the wrong problem. In terms of situational awareness, these are my kind of two favorite tools. Top left, your top left, Wardley Maps. Simon Wardley, awesome guy, worth a Google. Kind of a strategist based in the UK. He's come up with this mapping technique, and I won't go into much detail here now, but suffice to say it's a very useful technique to understand business and technology landscapes. And this map in particular, a guy called Adrian Collier, a gent called Adrian Collier in the UK, works as a giving advice to VC firms, and did a great Wardley map of microservices and containers. So it's a kind of way to indicate where as a business we should be investing. Where are we getting value? Where should we choose to invest? Should we build our own platform? Should we build our own microservices? These kinds of things, And Phil Calcado talked a lot about this in relation to his work with microservices at SoundCloud. I think Phil was here last year, actually. But Phil did a great blog post about how SoundCloud mapped out their value stream from idea to delivering value. And for them, microservices and the kind of trimmings in terms of the way the teams are broken up were the right choice for them. They knew by going to systems that were more self-contained and it could be easier to deploy them, that would add a lot of value to their business, So these techniques, sort of Wardley mapping, definitely worth a read, value stream analysis, to understand kind of situational awareness. You've got to know where you are before you can choose where to go, often. Once you've got your situational awareness, it's about, this is a very lofty slide, should we say, defining goals and strategy. Like, if I could do this right, I probably wouldn't be standing here. I'd be like Donald Trump or someone, probably be doing something completely different. As in, this stuff is really hard, and, not many people have got it right. But you do need to create like smart goals, as they say, specific, measurable, these kind of things. Make sure to get all stakeholders involved. A lot of my consultancy gigs now, people bring us in to build microservices, but the goals they set are massively different depending on who's brought us in. If it's a development team bringing us in, it's just like, we need to carve up this system, and how do we do it? If it's operations, it's basically, how can we carve this thing up so we can separate stuff we want to scale out or not? And if it's a business bringing me in, it's a very different set of goals. But often, you need to get all people together to get the true value of what you want to do in the system, if that makes sense. But it's easier said than done. Once you've got your goals as a business, as an organization, pick your strategy, whether you use something like references I've got on here. That's up to you. But the key thing is about sharing outcomes throughout the organization. Many times as a technologist, and particularly junior in my career, I was building things and I didn't really know why. Yeah. So now I like doing these kind of things. Now I'm in that position. I've been a CTO of a couple of companies. I've done architecture stuff as well. I like doing these. I think I borrowed it from HBR. And I think ThoughtWorks do similar kind of stuff as well. It's basically mapping your strategic goals back to architecture goals and then back to kind of development goals, design and practice goals. And there's a bunch of techniques I can recommend for generating this. You need to get key stakeholders involved. But once everyone's kind of engaged and, and chipped in their thoughts, this can be a really nice thing, not just to put up on the wall, because it's very easy just to chuck this stuff up on the wall and say, yeah, we're strategic, but to refer back, when I'm in the trenches, coding on this Go microservice, how does that actually relate through to architectural principles? And vice versa, if I'm in the C-suite and I see people trying new technology, they're trying Docker, they're trying Go or whatever, and I'm wondering why they're doing it, I can hopefully map down through. We want to eliminate accidental complexity because we want to move faster, these kind of things. So this is a nice tool to basically get buy-in, to share the vision, and allow conversations to be had across the organization. This is key. We talk a lot about ubiquitous language in terms of DDD, and we know the value of that, yeah, but there's a lot of value to be had in a ubiquitous language across the business. What are we all here for? What's our goals? When I've noticed successful organizations, when it starts clicking, the DDD thing often cuts in. The business talk the same language. The developers talk the same language. But at a higher level, I've seen really functional organizations where everyone is super aligned. And you'll see tonight, Fred George in particular talks a lot about this kind of thing, getting everyone on the same page. Everyone is there to deliver value to the business. It's easy to say, hard to do, but this is one tool. Technical leadership is super important, particularly for microservices, I think. I take a lot of my cues from Simon Brown here, awesome book, and he says architecture and kind of technical leadership is around promoting shared understanding. It's about effectively communication, not just code, but high-level architecture as well. Clearly about risk management. If you're going to bring in Docker, you're going to bring in something like microservices, there is inherently risk involved with something new in the stack. You need to manage that. And the key thing is about just enough upfront design. Yeah, I've struggled with this. In my career, like my 15-year career, I've really struggled with how much architecture is just enough. Yeah, I worked on SOA systems where we massively over-engineered it. I've worked on agile systems where we didn't do enough. It's really hard, yeah. But I think with microservices, two things I've definitely learned are boundaries. Getting your system boundaries defined right, and it won't happen on the first time, probably, but getting your boundaries right, getting your interfaces right, whatever that means. I'm not just talking about REST, I'm talking about messaging and a bunch of other things as well. Boundaries and interfaces, super important, super important, as is what I've called the glue. And the glue is the kind of essential platform artifacts like service discovery, like load balancing, like fault tolerance. You can do them like in the Netflix stack, you can do them in the code, or if you're using something like Kubernetes, you can do it in the platform. And you want to make sure you've thought about these things and as a team made the decision, where are we pushing the operational complexity? Because there is always complexity when you're operating something. You can either lift it up into the code or you can push it into the platform. And there's a nice balance there as well. I'm not going to talk about Conway's Law because I think that one's been kind of done to death. Yeah, Conway's Law is well accepted, aligning services with teams and vice versa. But I think in this model, something that kind of gets skipped is where architects fit into this. Yeah, it's all very well having aligned teams, but do we have an architect kind of overarching? Feels a bit of an anti-pan, a bit enterprisey, an enterprise architect. Do we have them consulting to teams, or do we have an architect on the team, every team that we've carved out? What I've seen best is some person acting as an architect per team, someone who is a technical leader on the team. Yeah. There's a couple of reasons for that. I think one is if you're sitting on the team, you get a lot of context, and you can often step out to, say, weekly architecture meetings where you look at architecture from the bigger level as a group, as a team. But the biggest thing I like is a lot of teams I see in the wild, they're kind of scrum teams or whatever, they often have a product owner, and then they have kind of developers and operators and QA. But it's always the product owner as the kind of leader of that team, or at least the core stakeholder of the team. And the problem is the stakeholder is clearly incentivized, the product owner, sorry, is clearly incentivized for business goals. They're always going to push the business goals more than the technical goals, unless you're very lucky with your stakeholders. But you need someone at a technical level that's willing to fight, particularly if you're migrating to microservices. Seen a couple of projects that just stalled because the product owners were incentivized to deliver new functionality, but no one was incentivized to make sure the platform was good for the long term. So we all agreed as a team, we're going to be delivering microservices, we're going to be carving the monolith up, but every time there was a decision, could we deliver value today or invest in the future, it was always we're going to deliver value today because the product owner had the final say. So what we did is we actually moved up a technical lead to each team who had equal weighting and equal responsibility. And they could fight basically the battles and say, no, we're going to make the decision. It didn't always happen that way. Sometimes, obviously, the business, it's the right decision to make to actually push forward and to get value today. But you need someone having that kind of that battle, someone at the same level. Otherwise, it leads to this kind of thing, technical insanity anti-pattern. And it's kind of, we created a mess with a monolith, but no changes required in our approach to implementing microservices. And Simon Brown said it even better, I think. He said, if you can't build a well-structured monolith, what makes you think you can build microservices? Fair question, I think, isn't it? So we need strong technical leadership. If you're trying to migrate to, from a monolith to microservices without any changing kind of strategy or tactics around your technical leadership, I think you'll find it really hard. I personally did on one of the gigs I did about 3 years ago. Moving towards more technology now, but teams in technology, super interesting. I like this concept of inner source. Now, inner source, kind of buzzword, but it's basically taking the principles and practices we've learned from open source. And I think we all agree open source is a good thing, yeah? I've not heard many people say otherwise, apart from the vendors losing money. Open source is a great thing, but there's many things we can learn that we can use internally in our companies. Now, there's big companies behind it. The slide on the left there is from PayPal. PayPal do a lot of this stuff, and they've created a kind of commons, a shared Creative Commons website. It's gone quite loud. Is that right? Sorry. They created a shared Creative Commons website, and they put lots of cool material up there talking around how to operate an inner source model. When you say move your teams, your microservice teams, to smaller units, you need to be able to, say, share the code across the company, but you need also to have ways of contributing to the code. If you're separate from the team who owns the microservice, but you need something changing, how do you kind of do it? And the open source model works really well. Great book on the right, but I'll draw on the PayPal website on this one for a second and just highlight a few key things which I think are really interesting from their proposal. And they talk about open source being a way to share work with a wider audience. So, you can look at the code, you can submit changes. And I've seen this work really well in bigger organizations. They used to be really siloed. They had separate SVN repos or whatever. We've moved them to things like Git and GitLab. Obviously, GitLab, be careful with that one if you're going. I heard what happened last week. But we've moved them to Git and GitLab, and we've basically opened up the repos as read-only to everyone, and the teams kind of have ownership, and you do PRs against the repo. It's things like written and posted to public sites. So here, rather than, a lot of us have tribal knowledge with our systems. We don't write stuff down, we just explain it to the person who joins the team, and it just gets distorted. So writing only a little bit of stuff, very lightweight, think of it drawing a map rather than trying to copy the territory. Draw a map so that developers, coming onto the team can pick up the code quickly. This kind of stuff is super valuable. And again, it's common in open source because you're working in a distributed environment or over kind of a globally distributed environment. And things like CI and CD are kind of baked in because you don't know who's contributing code, so you need to bake in your quality guidelines in the testing, which I think is fantastic as well. So inner source, if you haven't heard of it and you're in an organization that's kind of struggling with some of these things, it's a nice resource to give. There's resources there for technical people and sort of management as well. It's a great website, the PayPal one. Going a bit more into technology now. So I see a lot of microservices being driven by things like, say, Spring Boot and Docker. Now, they're awesome technologies. Don't get me wrong, I love Spring Boot, love Docker. My book actually covers both of those things. But a lot of people are having sort of the wrong conversations when they're talking about bringing in technology. Yeah. So you need to have, this is the spine model. It's a really cool thing I bumped into about 2 years ago at an Agile conference. And it talks about often we get stuck as a species. We're a very successful species in terms of tools. We use tools quite a lot. Arguably, it's what separates us from our nearest kind of neighbors, evolutionary-wise. But we get stuck at a very dogmatic level with the tooling. I like Java, you like Go. I like Docker, you like VMs, these kind of things. And we need to be moving up through the spine. The idea is if you get stuck at equally plausible situations, Docker, VMs, what as a company are we promoting in terms of practices? What do we value? Now, if we value things like a strong tool chain, well, probably VMs might be better there because VMs have been around a long time. If we value security, arguably, VMs might be better again. But if we value quick moving, being able to embrace the latest kind of trends, Docker is great. Containers are great. Same kind of thing if you're battling Java. Java, awesome tool chain, but a bit heavyweight at the runtime. What do we as a company value? Do we value what we know? We know Java well, that kind of thing, that's good. We need to be making sure we're having the right conversations at the right level. Does that make sense? I think it's a really valuable tool. When I've seen it working, I've been involved in a few organizations where it has, with microservices, they've taken the opportunity to introduce new technology into the stack. So they're a Ruby shop and they're bringing in Java, these kind of things. And it can get a bit dogmatic at times. Should you build this service in Ruby? Should you build it in Java? But by moving up through the spine and having the conversations at the right level, we get much more quicker resolution and choosing these kind of things. Really valuable. Be aware of things like confirmation bias. Whatever you search for, you can pretty much find a yes. We've all done it, yeah? I do it all the time. Should I use Docker? Oh, there's 1,000 articles that say yes, we're good. Should I not use Docker? 1,000 articles that say no as well. Whatever you search for, you will be rewarded. Yeah, Google and DuckDuck are awesome technologies. But just an example here, there's a couple of articles, one saying Docker's been a disaster, one saying it's been awesome, and just by altering your search, you can get that one as your top kind of search. So be really careful about what you search for. Things like bias are super real. As a bit of an evening it's been a long day and it's been an awesome day, but lots of knowledge coming at you. A little bit of audience participation now. Just in terms of how easy it is to be tricked, I'm going to give you 3 choices. Who thinks the top line's bigger, bottom line's bigger, and both the same size? So who thinks the top line's bigger? One person, cool. Who thinks the bottom line is bigger? No one, good. Who thinks they're both the same size? It's 90% of the audience, yeah? So what I've actually done is I've tricked you. The top line is bigger, yeah? Do you see what I mean? That's very easy, isn't it? This one works every time. I've been writing this for a couple of years now. It's a brilliant thing. But it's true. And this book, actually, Thinking Fast and Slow, I read it about 5 years ago. And I don't say this lightly. It genuinely changed my life. It is an amazing book that talks about the heuristics we use to make decisions as humans and the bias we suffer from. Everyone suffers from bias to some degree. And this book really helped me understand my bias, the kind of problems I've sort of had with decision making. But as a consultant, it's a super valuable tool for spotting bias in other people. And I've just found it really useful. It's so easy to be tricked in these things, yeah? And kind of the antipattern I want to talk about now is this kind of Netflix technical envy. And it's not just Netflix, it's Google, Amazon, Twitter, whatever. People, in terms of valuation, just trust these companies. They've done really cool stuff, and they have done really cool stuff, yeah? But the problem is, people just blindly copying them. They don't take time to learn about the principles, practices, and cultures that led to the emergence of the technology. And now Adrian, again, talks a lot about this. If you haven't seen the Netflix culture deck, highly recommend checking it out. It talks a lot about the culture in Netflix that led to microservices. So arguably, it's kind of it's real kind of inception. It's before microservices were even a thing there. But you need to understand, if you choose the Netflix stack, Spring Cloud brings a lot of this stuff in. Understand the advantages and the drawbacks. Make the decision consciously. If you choose the Twitter stack, finagle, really cool. If you're a Scala shop, finagle is awesome. But there is some trade-offs with it as well. Make sure you kind of, in terms of evaluation, do really think about what you're getting into. Look at the advantages, look at the disadvantages. So, second part of the talk, feedback. Visibility and constant learning is super important. Yeah, anyone who gets into the IT industry, I think, is basically saying, I'm keen to learn, I'm keen to get feedback, I'm keen to grow. It just moves so fast, we have to. Now, conveniently, I think earlier on, another presentation earlier on talked about very similar breakdown in terms of business, architecture, and operations, but feedback is essential at all of those levels, all three of those levels. And if you look at, if anyone's read the Phoenix Project, things like that, the kind of systems thinking, optimizing for feedback, and eventually optimizing for a kind of culture of experimentation, a lot of the high-performing organizations we see now, like your unicorn companies, but many other successful mainstream companies, like Walmart and things like that, are doing this. They're basically baking in feedback, running very fast experiments, and outpacing their competitors. Yeah, so this stuff is really valuable. And microservices are a good excuse often to get it in there, or they're even the reason to get it in there. Microservices allow us to deploy independent units of code very quickly. That's the promise. From a business point of view, it can be as simple as getting a dashboard. I did this with a client about 5 years ago, I think it was, a dashing framework. It was a microservice project. We didn't really call it microservices back then, but it was a small service project. And we baked in metrics, I think using Codahale metrics at the time, and exposed them in a very simple dashboard. And the CEO of this startup company loved it because he could look at this, the screen and basically see, like the number of baskets are going up, and these kind of things, and the value of the baskets are going up. Real simple stuff can be a really key enabler sometimes, like putting up dashboards. And these are, I'm talking here about business, but also sort of development dashboards, information radiators truly are valuable, I think. Going back to the business point for a second, I think microservices should be business-driven, definitely. And to do that, we need to be baking in metrics and signals to kind of be able to close the loop. If we come up with a hypothesis, we can only really validate it with appropriate metrics. Yeah. So when you're building out your platform, you're building out your microservices, bake these things in, bake these signals, these metrics in. And share them. Again, I put up the dashboard there, but make an effort to share this stuff throughout the organization. Even though it's maybe a technical endeavor, it gives kind of buy-in throughout the organization when people start seeing the results of what's happening. Now, I've shared Walmart here because they did a really nice story on the Lightbend channel, and their conversions went up after they split into a microservice domain. They did a whole bunch of other changes as well, some organizational changes and some platform changes, but they clearly had measurable business value from doing this kind of thing. And I worked with a company in the UK 3 years ago called notonthehighstreet.com. It's kind of like an online marketplace, a bit like eBay. And we did exactly the same thing. They were actually struggling every year on Black Friday, the sheer volume of traffic on their website, and they weren't as nimble as they wanted to. And I worked with them over 18 months, and we basically split up some of the monolith, we put in the kind of foundations for a platform, and the work there is still going on now, but they had similar kind of things. They were clearly seeing benefit to microservices when they drove it from a business point, when they'd engaged their business as well. Architecturally, you definitely need to optimize for feedback as well. Now, working sort of from left to right, people familiar with Adam Thornhill's work? It's really cool stuff. Yeah, I met Adam a couple of times. Real nice guy, super smart. But he talks about what you see, what looks like a city on the top there is actually it's a tool called CodeMat. M-A-A-T, and combined with some other tools, and that's actually a visual representation of a code base. Yeah, and the wide cities and the tall cities are cities with high, say, cyclomatic complexity, or they're large code bases, high cyclomatic complexity, and the colors are churn rates in version control. Yeah, so where you see like high, tall, wide buildings, it's like a lot of code, complex code, and it's being churned a lot. Yeah, so like Adam kind of says, like they're your slums. You don't go to those places in the code base. You're forced to because it's a constant churning area, but you really don't like going in there. You like the kind of gentrified areas where everything's low and flat. But the point I'm trying to make here is this is a really valuable tool for understanding what's in your code. We did this at Not on the High Street on a simpler level, just using like sort of circles and breaking down things. But it was really insightful to see in the code where complexity was. There was definitely some like, oh yeah, that's obvious. There was also some surprises. We didn't think that was particularly complex, but it was. And there was areas with clear churn. We were going in like daily almost and redoing the code. Yeah, as a little bit of a joke goes, one of the things, the wedding service was constantly popping up like as an area of complexity. But these things, getting a sort of, getting like a baseline of where your architecture is, and then optimizing for feedback as you break things down is really useful. Same at the code level, things like Code Climate, Sonar Cube, depending on what your language is, are really useful. And if you're moving to microservices, you want to put this stuff in to make sure the code quality isn't diminishing. I've seen a few projects where their architectural quality was improving. They were breaking things up into services, but the code quality was going down. It was actually due to more junior members of the team joining and just not knowing Java that well. But these kind of things, getting these metrics in and optimizing for feedback at a development level and an architecture level, really valuable. And it is in terms of tracking how your microservice system is emerging as well. I've referenced Adrian stuff there, but we're not building Death Stars, none of our clients are, but we are building, when it gets to a certain number of services, you do want to visualize the connections between them. Bunch of tools out there to do that. In relation to this kind of architectural feedback thing, the antipattern I'm going to talk about is the Trojan monoservice, as I've called it. And if you look at the Trojan horse here, it looks like it's made up of little microservices, yeah? But it actually gets rolled in en masse. Yeah, it's basically sneaking in. I'm doing microservices. You accidentally sneak in a monolith. Yeah. Now, hat tip to Matt Skelton, who is a consultant in the UK, and a friend of mine, and he runs the London Continuous Delivery Meetup. Real nice guy. He did this great presentation. And he talks about types of software monolith, which really, I'd sort of thought of this stuff, but he just codified it so well. So I'm going to reference his work. And I see this. People, although they get away from the application monolith, there's a tendency to move back towards the monolith. We've made a bunch of mistakes, so we want to correct them. For that one project I worked on, I'd never quite got the platform, the kind of archetype, Maven archetype right. So when I redid the stuff, I made sure the archetype was perfect, but I'd solved the wrong problem. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Often the monolith drifts in somewhere. We all know and love, or maybe hate, the application monolith. Joined at the DB, joined at the database is a pretty obvious one as well. But monolithic releases, basically a distributed monolith, that happens quite a bit as well. If people doing, let's say, semantic versioning of their microservices, before long, they're often deploying, say, all their microservices in one go. They're testing, version 1 of my platform is 1.2 of this, 1.3 of this, 1.7 of this, and it's a monolithic release. Now, what advantage does that really give you over a proper monolith? Probably is actually worse, yeah? So monolithic releases, distributed monoliths, very bad, but there's monolithic thinking. What I'm seeing quite a bit at the moment with clients, and I get it, because I've kind of been there as well, it's very easy to criticize, but it's just my observations, is wanting to create, say, a perfect platform. I think I've actually got that one in the next slide. But people this monolithic standardization, if only we can get our kind of foundations of our microservice framework perfect, then we'll have all the problems dealt with. And what it often leads to is this kind of monolithic thinking, where you're putting in all these dependencies to create this perfect platform, and as it evolves, it becomes really unwieldy, because you're trying to have this kind of like chassis or framework where your microservice sits on, and you're constantly having to pull in and update all these different services. So there's many ways kind of monolithic thinking or a monolith can sneak into coding. The advice in relation, trying to sort of make it more tangible to the feedback thing, is continually retrospect when you're breaking up a monolith, when you're doing microservices, but use metrics, yeah? I've seen far too many sort of retrospectives where people just talk about what they think. And there's definite value in sharing feelings and emotions and thoughts, but there's obviously clear value in making some of those thoughts metric-driven. We think we're going slower, like prove it, show me the burn down chart. We think the technical quality is getting better. Show me, prove it, yeah? So these things, simple and contrived as they may sound, many projects I work on don't initially do these things. So if you are going to be driving big changes, microservices, make sure you're tracking with metrics the progress you're making, yeah? From an operational point of view, a couple of technical things, like in terms of logging and I think monitoring and alerting, they're the kind of super important operational things. And these are a couple of things for me as a Java developer, but as a developer in general, there's some good references there. I'll share the slide deck later and you can go and download them. But in terms of this talk, what I'm going to say is when bad things happen, people are always involved, yeah? And I personally like to be this person in the corner with a beer, not really caring, yeah? That's my general consultant mindset. The thing is, you really need to think, once you've got the basics kind of in, and this comes from Mikey Dickerson, and Mikey worked on healthcare.gov, which I don't know if people are familiar with healthcare.gov in the UK. few years ago, President Obama rolled out the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, and unfortunately, well, they needed a website where US citizens could go and subscribe and choose their healthcare because they buy insurance in the US. And unfortunately, the site, the way it was built, was a complete example of enterprise kind of development. There was 50 contractors involved, and the site went live and it fell over. What was fundamentally quite a simple kind of e-commerce-like site took 6 weeks to get back up and working. And Mikey was one of the people that went in. They got a bunch of really clever, sort of really well-respected US citizens, like from Nori from Google. She's like, I've heard her talk. She's got some awesome stuff to share. Mikey's talked. I'm not sure where he is now. But anyway, I digress slightly. Mikey did some really cool work. He basically went into healthcare.gov, saw all the problems, propped it up with Nori, with the rest of the team. And when they finished and they got the site working and everyone was happy, it was a crazy effort by all accounts. He came out with this kind of like something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah, the most important stuff is in the bottom. Like monitoring, for example, is super important. Allegedly, it goes that Mikey went into the developers one day, and everything was on fire. The website was falling over and stuff. And Mikey said, right, monitoring. How do you know like what's going on with the site when it's up, when it's down? And a lead developer pointed to like a monitor in the corner of the room. And Mikey was like, awesome, it's probably got Nagios or some kind of metrics on there. And actually the monitor was a TV with CNN on. And when they reported the site was down, they used to go and reboot it, yeah? That's the story, apparently. But he was like, what? This is crazy. So they put in really basic monitoring, really basic metrics. That's essential, yeah. But afterwards, if you look up the stack, it's all people-driven. Yeah, things like incident response, post-mortems, testing, planning, it's all about people. And I think my advice here, and check out Mikey's work. I put a link here to some of the stuff Nori talked about as well. But my advice is a little bit of standardization goes a long way. It's kind of contradicting what I said earlier about monolithic thinking and standardizing, but this is more at the process level. And I think a lot of us as techies, we resist process sometimes, yeah. And sometimes with good reason, but sometimes without. And in particular, we all know with microservices, we've got to automate as much as possible. It's clearly the done thing in the operational world. The scale means you have to automate things. You can't be restarting things manually. But we have to understand the problems, yeah, and therefore, like you do incident response, post-mortems, root cause analysis, all super useful tools, but having checklists to provide some structure is really beneficial. Now, I read Atawal's book. If you haven't read it, it's an amazing book. I do love reading. I commute quite a bit and travel quite a bit. Awesome opportunity to read. Atawal is a surgeon, and he talks about the value checklists have added to certain industries, like surgery and, say, airplane piloting. There's some things as humans we're very bad at, and it's kind of simple, regular tasks, like as a surgeon, washing your hands, as an airplane pilot, when you're taking off, making sure the flaps are up, and these kind of things. We just forget. We take a lot of shortcuts mentally. So simple thing like checklists can be really valuable to make sure, when we've got something that's very standardized and very sort of methodical, a checklist adds a lot of value. Now, checklists don't add value for creative endeavors, obviously, worth saying. But for things like post-mortems and root cause analysis, you want a kind of checklist of things. Have we talked about this? Did we understand why it happened? And again, I'll reference the GitLab stuff. People saw about the GitLab crash. Their post-mortem was super honest, and a hat tip to them. They're really cool people for being as honest with us with that kind of stuff. And they'd clearly gone down and thought about the approach they were taking. Susan's got an awesome book, Susan Fowler, Production Ready Microservices. Susan was an SRE at Uber up until a few months ago, and now she's a lead at Stripe. I think she's gone over to Stripe. But fantastic book. I was lucky enough to review it. She's done a couple of presentations. I put a link in for you there. But she talks a lot of it's kind of building not just Uber-like microservices, but it's building microservices that scale. And she used checklists a lot. And there's several checklists. There's architectural checklists, operational checklists. This is a highly recommended book. And just to kind of prove that, what I'm saying in terms of what I believe, I actually got a quote on the back cover. I'm super lucky to get a quote on the back cover. But saying this kind of thing, saying the production-ready checklist, that's what I put on my review comments. I was like, the production-ready checklist alone makes this book gold. Yeah, like it's a real nice compliment to Sam Newman's book and also the CA API Academy guys, microservice architecture book. This is a real nice book for thinking about creating systems that are production ready. Awesome. So when done well, microservices do enable agility. I've been very lucky to work with companies that have got microservices in production at various scales, and I've seen when it kicks off, it is seriously awesome. Yeah, things scale up really quickly, seeing people experimenting really quickly, it's genuinely awesome. But you need to build in signals and metrics at all different levels in the organization, from dev to architecture to business. And I think you need to define this kind of culture of experimentation and failing fast, which is really hard sometimes in larger organizations. But if you if you don't collect the data and take action to adapt, there's kind of little advantage with moving to microservices, I think, from all different levels. So just something to think about there. So final section is responsibilities. The buck always stops somewhere, responsibilities are super important. Sure, a few of you have seen this one, yeah? So as a consultancy, we're now hearing this a lot. People are ringing us up and they say we're either starting our journey to microservices or we're stuck halfway. We need you to come in and fix the tech. And we're like, yeah, we can do, but we'd like to know a bit about your business. We'd like to know about the people in the organization because we think that's super important. The pushback we get straight away is, no, just the tech, please. We're totally cool with the organizational stuff because we've decided to reform our team around squads, chapters, and guilds. Yeah. And I've literally seen Scrum teams rebranded as squads. Yeah, I think chapters was a Slack channel. Yeah, we got a chapter Slack channel. It's all good. And guilds was like we run a conference once a month or something like that. Yeah, it's completely cargo culting. Uwe mentioned this word cargo culting earlier. It's copying blindly without understanding things like the practices, the principles, and the values. Yeah, Adrian Cockcroft talks a lot about this with Netflix. People just copying what they can see without understanding why they've made those decisions. Why it's evolved in that way. And once you have, as an organization, discovered your practices, your principles and values, like, say, Spotify are optimizing for autonomy and kind of innovation. But if you're, say, building a nuclear reactor, autonomy and innovation are not two kind of words I'd like to hear, to be honest, yeah? But do you know what I mean? So think about what you're optimizing for. And when you do, put it into this kind of thing, codify it in the system as well, yeah? Close the loop. So how does DevOps fit into this? Like, DevOps is a nebulous term, I appreciate, but it is important at a technical and organizational level, I think, for what DevOps kind of encompasses. Hat tip again to Matt Skelton, awesome website, DevOps Topologies. It talks about bad ways to implement DevOps and good ways, and it discusses a little bit about what DevOps is. So for me, microservices do need some notion of DevOps. They're operationally harder to work with, things like that. So developers and ops need to work more closely. I've got a couple of other talks on InfoQ if you do want to check it out where I talk more about this. But for me, Matt's done a great job here, so I can't really do any more justice than Matt's done it. So pop onto his website and have a look. The ANTIPATTERN I'm seeing here, a lot of people bring in these kind of heroes. And I've got to be careful saying this because I'm a consultant, but I work in a company, yes, it's like 50 of us kind of thing. But I do see people trying to hire sort of these full-stack engineers, full-stack DevOps engineers. Full stack, when I started the industry, was I knew JavaScript and I knew Java. Yeah, I was full stack. Whereas nowadays, full stack is like everything from DevOps through to, front end or whatever. And Charity Majors, awesome lady, she's got some really good books, check out her books. But I bumped into her at CraftConf last year, and she did this great quote about hiring for people. And she was hiring for operational engineers, and people were coming to her saying, yeah, just hire me, I'm a full-stack DevOps engineer. And in the end, she pretty much said this. She goes, I'm sorry, but if you're not designing the computer chips and writing the website, then I don't want to hear from you as full stack. Yeah. And Kevlin Henney jokes about this, saying when people say they're full stack, he asks them what their device driver skills are like. Can you write device drivers? Yeah. More often, I certainly can't write device drivers. When you go, kind of thing. But just think, this hero culture is generally bad, and particularly DevOps has given some people a license to kind of peddle it, and it's very dangerous. DevOps is a cultural thing, I think, is a kind of more nebulous thing than that. Charity, yeah, check out Charity's talk. It's a little bit ranty, but Charity's a little bit ranty, but she does like some amazing stuff and very poignant. So for me, when we're working with more enterprise or more, say, traditional companies, things like RACI matrices help something. I know it's almost RACI and DevOps kind of seem the opposites, but they're not. RACI just stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And it basically, people within the organization or teams in the organization, you define who's responsible for things, who's accountable, who you should inform. And as a kind of precursor to DevOps, as a precursor to shared responsibility, using RACI matrix is really nice, actually defining who's doing what. And not so much as a blame, but just to know who's responsible. I've actually been called into firefight. My team and I have been called into firefight things. And the reason the problem has occurred is because no one actually owned the thing that's gone wrong. And again, GitLab, and keep hammering GitLab, but if you look at GitLab's post-mortem, again, super generous of them sharing it, one of the final bullet points, and I think the most damning of that bullet point, it says, no one owned the backup and recovery process. No one owned it, no one tested it, yeah? So having things like, and I've certainly done things like that as well, but defining who's responsible, who's accountable, when we're changing something, who we should be informed, is a great way to kickstart this kind of shared ownership. DevOps itself, this is kind of like, I read these 3 books and I think this is what DevOps is as a kind of, from a cultural and a technical thing. And I think we as engineers and so forth, when we're changing organizations, should focus on these things. Continuous delivery, mechanical sympathy, which is understanding the platform you're building for, things like that. Excuse me. Logging, monitoring, super critical, cross-functional requirements, these kind of things. These for me is what DevOps is all about. And if you're moving to microservices, moving your organization towards microservices, I think you're going to need to embrace these things. Yeah, they're super critical. And if you embrace only one of these things, it's continuous delivery. Yeah, continuous delivery is unbelievably valuable. And the point I like to make here is ask yourself, how much value does non-deployed code provide to users? How much value does non-deployed code provide to your users? And it's a big fat 0, yeah. And that's a universal metric of value, by the way, that 0 there, yeah. Just does, as developers, we might learn stuff, but our users don't get any value out of this kind of thing, yeah. So continuous delivery. Often you get continuous delivery in an organization, and it's the catalyst to drive massive change. When developers can see things deployed that they've coded, it's like, light bulb moment. Personal story, one of my first gigs was working for the UK government, where I worked there for over a year and got nothing in production. I went and worked for a startup after that, and my first day I pushed code into production. That was a moment of clarity for me. I was like, this is what I want to do. And even if I work for the government, which I have done since, continuous delivery is an enabler. Super powerful. The anti-pattern around this is the kind of water microfall thing. And I mentioned it earlier, I've seen some organizations spending a lot of time crafting these perfect systems, waterfall style. Oh, if only I can get the perfect microservice platform chassis. And they're just continually building on untested or unvalidated kind of assumptions, yeah. So mindset change, hard to do, but it's worth doing, is kind of cultivate that mindset for continuous delivery. Incremental changes to production as soon as possible. One of the first things I often do, if I can, and I've learned this from Tarek, who's CTO at OpenCredo, we push to production, like if we get called in on a gig, we push to production as soon as we can. We sort of often build out a pipeline, and not only does it technically make sure we can get like a simple hello world thing in production, we know we've got a pipeline, but it also brings out the organizational blockers. More often than not, you put the pipeline in, and then someone will jump out at the end and go, "Oh, you can't deploy to production." And that, we've got that's great. We've identified that on day 2. We know there's going to be these blockers from an organizational point of view. Whereas if we try and build up all these things and then deploy them a month or 2 later, we then run into the people that are going to cause us problems. So we get this kind of, Dan North calls it a dancing skeleton, getting something super simple in production through a pipeline as early as possible. So I'll skip through these ones because I'm getting tight on time. But fundamentally, microservices will create change, yeah, at an organizational level, for sure. Therefore, it's a little bit businessy, a little bit boring perhaps, but change management, as a techie, I primarily identify as a techie, learning some of these things like fair process, which comes from HBR, has been really beneficial to me as a technologist. I now can manage people a lot better, and I can, set the kind of core drivers for change. Transformation change is a process, and it's one, it's not something you can do overnight. You can't buy DevOps, yeah? You can't buy microservices, to be honest. These things, they're so transformational, they take a long time to get into the kind of system. This is a fantastic book, and it kind of summarizes what I've done in probably a more elegant way, more business thing, but Douglas Cotter's leading change. If you are doing some drastic change, or some fundamental change, which, let's be honest, that's probably why you're here at this conference. You're looking to learn new things. If you're bringing in microservices to a tech stack, reading this book alone will be super useful. It gives kind of actionable steps on how to actually drive fundamental change in businesses. Wrapping up, I talked a lot about strategy. These are your key things for strategy: communication, shared kind of ownership, and so forth. Technical leadership skills, choosing tooling that supports your approach and not the other way around. Don't be driven by the tooling. Tooling should just make your life easier, these kind of things. Getting feedback, mechanisms in. Optimizing for visibility and learning throughout the stack is vital. And responsibilities, by all means, learn from Conway, learn from Netflix, learn from Amazon, learn from Google, but don't blindly cargo cult. Understand the practices, the principles and stuff where they got the reason why they have got to where they have. And DevOps done right, I think, is a prerequisite for whatever definition of DevOps you choose, but make sure you do it in the right way. It's an organizational thing as much as it is a technical thing as well. On that note, I shall say thank you very much.
So, thanks a lot for the talk. I guess we have still time for 1 or 2 questions. The key to asking a question is to raise your hand first.
I'm conscious there probably is beer around, is there? And everyone's like, oh, beer. I'll be around for the conference for the next couple, today and tomorrow. So if you do want to come and chat to me, feel free to drag me aside as well. I'm more than happy to do that.
Yeah, so thanks again.
Cool.
And next talk is going to be at 12:30. Fred is going to talk about what he does with IoT and microservices. And so thanks a lot and have a great evening.
Yes, sir.